Well, you've translated and written about existential psychology. Could you describe briefly what that is?
Yes. Existential psychology has been one main trend, generally submerged all the way down through the whole history of human thought. It stands over against essence. Essence and existence was the way they put it in old days. And the existential side is the side which, as its name implies, is concerned with man as existing, man, women, and children, people, as they exist. This is why it's not so much interested in abstractions, but it takes them as they immediately live and move. And this is why also Socrates was one of the early existentialists. His dialectical method is a very existential method. Augustine was, despite his otherworldly thoughts, was very existential, and his talks about will, things of that sort. Now, what the existentialists do all through history is to use psychological terms with an ontological meaning. Will is a psychological term, but they use that as meaning not only psychology, but as meaning the will in the universe, the will and idea, as Schopenhauer put it, the will as intentionality, and all of these, and this use of will, as Nietzsche uses will, it's more than just psychology. Love is used by the existentialists not only as a passion between two people or a libido reaction, but used also as an ontological term. And ontological means being. It comes from the Greek word ontos and means that I study somebody else or study something or myself in terms of its fundamental being. You can see then how will and love, intentionality are used not as psychological reactions, but as part of the being of the universe. You now are being. I am being. And being as a participle means as a description of the process of our lives. We are being. 5 minutes ago, we were being something slightly different.
Existential psychology focuses on things like loneliness and courage and
Sure.
will, freedom.
Exactly.
You don't see those kind of things in other psychological reading, at least.
Well, those things are psychological terms used in ontological form, in, say, freedom, loneliness. When the symbols and myths are accepted and used, then you have classical philosophy, like Plato and Aristotle. When these symbols and myths break down, such as with Pascal or Augustine, both of these men lived at the critical disintegrating periods of their time. And in our time, we are in a disintegrating period. The appearance of existential philosophy is exactly a symptom of the crisis situation. Tillich tells about his becoming an existentialist, in preference to his old German idealism, when he was in the war. One night there was a great battle on the Verdun front, and all his friends were brought in dying and cut to pieces. And during that night, said Tillich, I became an existentialist. Now, it's a philosophy and a psychology for a time of crisis. This is why the philosophers of our present modern existentialism, Marx, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre, Heidegger, were men who not only do these things I've been saying, they talk about will in its larger terms, but they were men who were both psychologists and philosophers. This is the interesting thing. Sartre writes about psychological topics, imagination, courage, things of that sort. These subjects are scorned by present-day analytic philosophy as being non-philosophical, and they are scorned by most academic psychology as being non-psychological. So most of what you do is scorned by the two disciplines that ought to understand you best. This leaves you in a terrible situation. But the existentialists come to your rescue. They present both a philosophy and a psychology that deals with you as you exist in the now, and you as you hope in the now, which means you relate to your loneliness. You hope to overcome it with love. You as you will in the now. And will in the existentialist sense means the intentionality that's involved in every word I use. Our communication is very much a process of involves will. I think existentialism made a great contribution to psychology, much more than is realized. Pearls is an existentialist. He writes in the beginning of his Gestalt therapy, verbatim, Gestalt therapy is a form of existential psychotherapy, and he's completely right. Now, the use of the now, this was not in most psychotherapy, say, 30, 40 years ago. Now, any therapist I know always begins with the now. What your problem is, not only when you first come, but when you first come each day, what your problem is. This is crucial. Now, this is a contribution of existentialism. I think the coming of will back into psychiatry, at least, more than psychology, but certainly psychology, is one of the contributions of existentialism. Now, there's one thing more I ought to say. I became an existentialist in this year and a half, or 2 years, when I lay in bed looking at the ceiling, anxious about the cavity in my lung, whether it would become larger or smaller. I only could tell by one X-ray every month. Now, anxiety is the most important word of all for the existentialists. And they use it, not in our sense of being worried, but in the German sense of Angst. Angst is anxiety made ontological. Heidegger says every human being is a human being who, as soon as he is aware of being, meaning at this process of consciousness that begins quite early, becomes anxious. And he is anxious not because he can't do something. He is anxious as part of his being in relation to non-being. Being is always threatened by non-being, ultimate death, deprivation, mother might not come home. All of these things, one of them the infant thinks, mother might not come home, death obviously doesn't think about too much later. But these are all used now ontologically. Now, I believe that, well, I should say along with anxiety, guilt. Anxiety is an apprehension that you may be threatened. You may not be able to do what you need or want to do. You may not be able to express your potentiality. Guilt is the awareness that you haven't. And this is why anxiety and guilt are somewhat related, as both ontological. Now,
before you go on, you talked a lot about loneliness and love and anxiety. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about will and intentionality. When I read about intentionality, it sounded to me to be a kind of orientation toward people and the world. When Don and Bonnie and I talked about it, we came up with an attribution of meaning. One's intentionality gave meaning to what one says and does. So I wonder if you could talk some more about that.
Yes, it's both those things. Your orientation to the world, to other people, is also what gives meaning to these other people and the world. If I see a tree outside, I may think, oh, this tree would make good lumber. Then that is the meaning of this orientation to the tree. Or if I see a white birch tree, let us say, outside, and I think how beautiful the tree is, then this also gives it its meaning. Now, the important thing about intentionality, you already have told us. It includes both perspective, your way of relating to the world, and the meaning that you then give these forces or other people and the meaning that they communicate to you. Now we have to agree here that there are an infinite number of perspectives that you can use. Now, intentionality is the relationship between the external thing, say the tree or another person, and myself. And my meaning comes partially out of the tree and certainly partially out of the other person. This is very difficult for us in this country who have been so taught to be objective in our thinking and talking. It's very difficult for us to understand. But a Zen Buddhist could not only understand it immediately, he'd tell you that to start with. Now this is phenomenology, or at least it's one kind of caricature of phenomenology. And I think it's a very valuable approach, not only to psychology, but to literature, to art. Our whole culture has been vastly influenced by the existentialist movement. The drama that comes to New York these days, if it's good, it's almost always existential. Beckett and Ionesco and all of these, particularly the Frenchmen.
Rollo, you deal extensively in your writings and in your speeches with the conditions and problems of being, but you don't describe yourself as an existential psychologist. Why is that so? And in what way do you use existentialism as a therapist?
Yes, well, once a person describes himself as an existential therapist, he's no longer as existential. Now, I say that jokingly, of course, but no, I'm an existential therapist. I also am a psychoanalyst. I also am a humanistic psychologist, and I also am a few other things. I do not reject the term. I only say that classifying people is totally unexistential. And this is why Sartre refused the Nobel Prize a few years ago. He knew if he accepted it, he would then become an institution. And the existentialists are most of all against the objectification of human beings, making them all into institutions or robots, which is really a result of the industrialism, the capitalism.
So the labeling is restrictive.
Yeah, we would not label. I certainly would not call myself anti-existential. Now, I use existentialism in my therapy. I never talk about it unless the client happens to bring it up, because talking about it is completely unexistential. I listen to where his intentionality is. When he comes in the door, I am very alert and aware of how he comes in, where he sits, what he sits down, where he sits down, how he looks at me. I'm quiet during these early moments of a session because I want him to structure it. And then he structures it and does his best to find some kind of being. This might even be a synonym for myth there, by which he can understand his problems better, can orient to the world, can deal with the quarrel he had with his wife or she had with her husband.
You talked about intentionality and myth, and they seem similar to me, and there's a great deal of our intentionality comes from our culture, and the meaning we give our experience is supplied by the cultural myths and so on. In working on therapy, someone comes in and it appears that this cultural myth has put them in a bind or caused an anxiety which is not productive for them. How do you then work on helping them expand their mythology or their intentionality so that the world appears in a fuller way, not as restricted, in terms of your own work with the client?
Yes, well, this, by definition, Don, is too broad a question because it's different with every patient. Okay. It's interesting that I find, not by my own intention, but by my own intentionality, of which I am unconscious, that I find patients experience me entirely differently from each other. And then they tell me afterwards how we worked on things, what we did. I find that I was a quite different person. Now, I'm still the same person, and my function as a therapist is the function of reality. He comes into the room and he sits down, and then he tries to build his world. Perhaps he doesn't really try to understand it at the moment. Let's say he just tries to build it the way he always builds it outside. But I am also in the room. That's not true outside. You can find people that fit into it. And my responsibility is to be myself, if he asks me whether I agree with something, I answer very frankly. And it is through that means that ultimately the transformation occurs. Now, the transformation, I think this is a better way of explaining what Freud meant by transference. Freud described that in negative terms. It was a neurotic phenomenon, but it is not neurotic wholly. And in our communication, then he finds that the, well, let's say the paranoid ideas or the, if he, say, has been commanding his parents to do things, obviously he will try to command me. The only thing is I am a human being like him, and I would respond to these commands, not by doing what he tells me to, but by pointing out to him the fact of the commandment and what goes on that he needs to command me. Now, probably he's scared stiff, frightened of me, frightened of the world. And then we have a beautiful avenue into his anxiety. But if I talk much about therapy, I'm very much afraid we will go too far afield. Each therapeutic case has to be handled in its own way. And I think that the flexibility is one of the chief characteristics of the existential approach. Couch or the chair. Patient or he may talk or he may not. But his silence is just as important as his talk. And so on.
I guess part of the thing I'm trying to get to is whether the therapeutic relationship is only one instance of the personal relationship between any two persons, and it's set up in a certain way for interaction, and the difficulties people have relating outside the therapeutic hour is also the kind of difficulties will show up there, and that there isn't that therapy and how one struggles to live their life creatively.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with what you say. Therapeutic training ought to, which I think is very necessary, ought to sharpen us, our sensitivity to human beings of all sorts, and should then give us the capacities to, react. There is some technique very much involved, but I think technique ought always to be subordinate to understanding. I must know what I am been trained to know about psychoanalysis, but once I depend upon my technique, then I'm lost, because then I have become the twister of bolts of this other person. First of all, I'm a human being, and last of all, I am.
You've said that many clients now come to therapy because of problems of loneliness. And I would think then that in the therapeutic relationship, they would begin to experience intimacy. But as we've talked before, people have problems with intimacy either because they're afraid of absorption or they're afraid of their dependency needs. How do you work through that in the therapeutic relationship? The therapist is also a human being, has those same fears.
Yes, well, loneliness, as I said a minute ago, is one of the central ontological aspects of being. Mm-hmm. And the existentialists make a great deal of it. Camus and Sartre and Paul Tillich. And they also say, as I have said and would say again, that loneliness and love are part and parcel of each other. The fact that we are lonely means that we need to reach out to other people and to find some other people that can understand us, and we can understand, that we can relate to, that we can love, and they can love us. Now, there are various problems about love, and these, in our culture especially, are very much hooked up with dependency or a counter reaction against dependency.
Rollo, you've been talking about the destruction of the old myths, and that we live in a time in which the myths are gone, that gave cultural myths which gave us support, and the new myths haven't yet been born. And I wonder if you could talk about how you personally live in this time when the cultural myths are gone.
Yes, I've thought a great deal about that. I remember back at Oberlin, after I'd taken this course in Greek that was so meaningful and so much joy for me, I came back the next year, my senior year, and I dropped Greek. Now, I've always puzzled as to why I dropped it. I then went to Greece. It would have been of tremendous value if I'd kept up the study, and it would have saved me a great deal of time, but the richness I renounced. Now, why was this? Well, I believe it was because I am a product, like most Americans, of the frontier myth. And I am taught that active work is what's important. I dropped it with the reason, which turned out to be rationalization, that I was going to write editorials for the newspaper. I did that, but that's no reason for dropping the Greek. It wasn't because I was planning to be a writer then. I wasn't. It wasn't because it was too hard. I dropped it because of what came out of my own childhood, a suspicion of subjectivity. On the frontier, everybody had to be objective, or they really were in danger of going crazy. My father very much emphasized objectivity. I should not permit myself to take a subject that I love just for the sake of loving it. Now, also I believed in active work, and you shouldn't study too much. It's very interesting how this is part of the frontier myth. And I should only devote my energies to building things, very concrete things. Now, in my years of thinking about that on and off, I have believed that the frontier myth, in that sense, was harmful for me, but that I was living by it. Now, the myth of competition, of course, I didn't believe in consciously, but I'm afraid I did unconsciously. Now, all of these aspects of the American dream, I had to reconsider. I had a long time when I was sick with my tuberculosis to reconsider them. And then I can say decided, but it's not really a decision. It's a growth into a decision, like intentionality. Then I came to the conclusion, the decision, that one has to live with some kind of myth, and that one had best live with the myths of the future. One had best try to discover what are the myths that are going to be the basis, the orientation, the spiritual center of the new world. And it seemed to me, if I may take my recent years, women's liberation is one of those. I have to learn and experience the fact that women certainly are my equals, and that economically, as well as psychologically, emotionally, when I deal with women in therapy, I am glad to say, if I may say it to friends, that I never use the word role. I never speak of their, or never even think they're having to subordinate themselves to husbands. And I think my therapy now is relatively free from these old distortions. Now, the positive side of the myth of women's liberation is that I can affirm, granted I am not over all my past problems, emotionally it still hangs on in some ways, but that I can and want to affirm women's individual existence, their rights, their future with them, how to relate to them in a way that doesn't presuppose my having the power hand. And if you read Power and Innocence, which was my last psychological book, you will find that there women are supported as they aren't generally in past literature. Now, the symbol of one world, this is also going to be, to my mind, a symbol of the future. The symbol of interracialism, which is an outworking of the compassion that I talked about earlier, that seems always to have been part of me, so far as I can tell. When anybody asks me a question after a talk that what myths are we going to live by, what I propose is that each of us tries, in himself and in his community, to find the myths and symbols that he genuinely believes the future will be founded upon, and then tries to live proleptically with those myths and symbols. See, take the economic situation. What I have to ask myself is, what kind of economical system are we going to live in the future? Well, as far as I can tell, we're going to live in a much more socialistic economy. We're going to live in an economy that will predicate the value of the worker. Now, these are my different ways of asking. Or if I can just add one other thing, the field of art. What do I find in art that ministers to me, that gives me a sense of overcoming my loneliness? It's the language of the artist that speaks to me. The artist and I then have a communion, whether he was Michelangelo and lived 400 years ago, or whether he's a modern artist and still living. Well, I have to, my responsibility is what I mean by I have to. My responsibility is to find and appreciate those forms of art that seem to tell me most about the spiritual undercurrent, the depths of our society. And with those artists, I can not only appreciate what they do, but I can also do some of it myself, but I can have a communion that is a genuine communication, a very powerful communication. Now, I could say the same with music and a few other things, but the idea I hope to get across is that our responsibility individually to ourselves and our society is to find the myths and symbols that we believe will become most important in the future, and to live on the basis of those.